A parched and forbidding wasteland, to those who journeyed through it over the years, Western Mojave is a harsh, inhospitable land of sometimes stunning contrasts, a land of bone-chilling nights and griddle-hot days, of violent dust storms and mesmerizing sunsets. The primitive landscape was dominated by one truly remarkable feature. When she first gazed upon it early in this century, homesteader Jeanette Darr said of it, "I thought it was the jumping-off place of creation, that curiously flat wasteland called Dry Lake." Many years later, however, the aviation pioneer General Albert Boyd would call it God's gift to the Air Force. First formed in the Pleistocene epoch, Rogers Dry Lake is one of nature's most unique creations. Flattest and hardest of all natural landforms, its parched clay and silt surface undergoes a timeless cycle of renewal each year as water from winter storms is swept back and forth by desert winds, smoothing it out to an almost glass-like flatness. Spreading out over 65 square miles, it is the largest geological formation of its kind in the world. The open spaces of the high desert, its isolation, arid climate, the clear blue skies overhead, and most importantly, the vast expanse of lake beds, were what caught the attention of then Lieutenant Colonel Hap Arnold when, in 1933, he was looking about for a bombing and gunnery range for his Marchfield squadrons. What others had seen as a curiously flat wasteland, Hap Arnold saw a natural airfield. In September of that year, a small contingent of troops arrived at the spot then called Muroc and laid out a bombing and gunnery range along the east shore of the lakebed. For the troops who comprised the Muroc Range Maintenance Detachment throughout the 30s, the place had little to offer. Theirs would be a tough, hardscrabble existence, life in a primitive tent camp community, long days of backbreaking work with few of the conveniences of civilization and even fewer diversions. They relieved the tedium of their daily routines. Their isolation seemed so complete, in fact, that among locals they came to be known as the Foreign Legion of the Army Air Corps. Their lonely exile was periodically interrupted, however, as flying units came in for training exercises. Among the first to arrive was a young captain named Ira Yeager, commander of the 95th Pursuit Squadron and, a decade later, the entire 8th Air Force. He was followed by countless others, as the remote bombing and gunnery range more than lived up to Hap Arnold's expectations. Indeed, by 1941, Muroc had become a regular stop for the men who'd guide American air power through the perilous times ahead. By that time, though most of the range maintenance detachments still lived in tents, a new, more permanent facility was rising up across the lakebed. And while training exercises proceeded, there were other activities taking place almost unnoticed, which were harbingers of things to come. John Northrop had been flight testing his N1M Jeep, his first true flying wing, at Muroc since 1940. By the late fall of 1941, a primitive sled track had been built on the lakebed where small, remotely controlled aircraft were being ground tested. Not far away, an exotic-looking, semi-tailless airplane was undergoing taxi tests. The airplane was the Curtiss-Wright CW-24B, a full-scale wood and fabric flying mock-up for a proposed interceptor. Now all but forgotten, the CW-24B lifted off from the parched surface of the lakebed for the first time on December 2, 1941, thereby becoming the first of more than 100 airplanes that would complete their maiden flights at this out-of-the-way place on the high desert. 5 days later, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and Muroc suddenly erupted with activity as troops and flying units from all over the country hastily assembled there. Barracks, hangars, mess halls, and other facilities, marvels of tar paper, wire, and wood, as one of the troops called them, went up almost overnight at what became known as South Base. In July of 1942, Muroc Army Airfield finally became a separate post. Its primary mission was to provide final combat training for fighter and bomber crews. And throughout the war years, thousands of young men would pass through it just prior to overseas deployment. It was at Muroc in 1942, for example, that Lieutenant Colonel Curtis LeMay first assembled and trained his famed 305th Bomb Group, molding it into a legendary fighting unit which set new standards for effectiveness in the 8th Air Force. And it was to Muroc, late in the war, that a by then Major General LeMay would send the cream of his 21st Air Force for B-29 crew training as they prepared for the final assault on Japan. It was at Muroc that these crews perfected their ability to navigate over vast distances and employ their bombing equipment with the kind of pinpoint accuracy that would have such a decisive impact on the outcome of the Pacific War. While the training mission continued at the south end of the lakebed, a much different type of mission had gotten underway in a restricted area just 6 miles to the north. There, in a top-secret test site, pieces of a radically new type of aircraft were unloaded from boxcars on September 19, 1942, and over the next 10 days it was hastily assembled. The airplane was the Bell XP-59A Aerocomet, and on October 2nd, Bell test pilot Bob Stanley launched America into the jet age as he lifted off from the lakebed. Testing continued over the next 2 years, and though the P-59 disappointingly lacked the performance of the best prop-driven fighters of the day, it nevertheless represented a start, the first of a long series of airplanes that would make the high desert base synonymous with the turbojet revolution in America. Indeed, the availability of the enormous lakebed made it almost inevitable. The development of the turbojet engine introduced a host of new problems. The new power plants were woefully underpowered, and thus the new jets required exceptionally long takeoff rolls. More critically still, the temperamental engines flamed out, and if pilots couldn't recover from engine stalls, their only hope was close proximity to a spacious airfield where they could attempt dead-stick landings. With miles and miles of available runways extending in every direction, the lakebed offered the most spacious landing field in the world. Throughout the decades ahead, it would be a welcome haven for countless pilots in distress. Thus, while the major training mission continued throughout the war, a growing number of aircraft, conventional airplanes such as the P-38 Lightning and the Lockheed Constellation, unconventional prototypes such as Northrop's XP-56 Black Bullet, purely experimental aircraft such as the N-9M and the rocket-powered MX-324, and even captured enemy aircraft such as the Me-163 Comet and the He-162 Volksjager were also undergoing flight test evaluations at the rapidly expanding North Base facility. In January of 1944, a major milestone occurred when a new Lockheed jet-powered prototype, the XP-80, lifted off for its maiden flight, demonstrating the truly remarkable advances that had been made in little more than a year since the XP-59's first flight. This impressive airplane was the prototype for America's first combat-worthy jet fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star. Where the P-59 had been outperformed by prop-driven fighters, the P-80 demonstrated in tests at Muroc that it could successfully attack bomber formations even when outnumbered 6-1 by the very best of the conventional fighters. And it convinced everyone that the Air Force would have to undergo a rapid transition into jet propulsion. The remarkable potential of that transition was underscored in June of 1947 when Colonel Albert Boyd returned the world speed record to America for the first time in 24 years, as he sped to more than 623 miles per hour over a course above the lakebed in a modified P-80R. It was the first of some 14 world speed records that would be set at the base over the next 18 years. But Boyd and other Air Force officials had set their sights much higher than speed records. As he stood proudly on the ramp that day, he'd already made a decision, which would dramatically alter the future course of aviation and indeed aerospace history. For he'd chosen the pilot and test crew who'd challenged the so-called and much dreaded sound barrier. The X1 program was the first in a long series of X, or experimental programs, that were designed to prove or disprove concepts, to probe the most challenging unknowns of flight, and solve their mysteries. It was conceived in response to a new and terrifying phenomenon, which fighter pilots had first encountered during the recent war. Pushing over into steep dives, they'd found themselves at speeds of 500 miles per hour and into the unknown region of transonic flight, where the effects of compressibility, loss of control, and structurally devastating aerodynamic loads began to take over with often deadly consequences. The new jet engines promised even higher speeds, passing through the transonic and even perhaps into the supersonic region. The critical question was, could a piloted airplane be designed and built which could survive in it? The aircraft designed to make the assault was the bullet-shaped and rocket-powered Bell X1, and the man who would try to fly it through the sonic wall was a young Air Force captain named Chuck Yeager. Assisted by a team from Bell and the NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, he and project engineer Captain Jack Ridley had a lot on their minds as Yeager edged his way cautiously toward Mach 1 throughout the fall of 1947. Military test pilots at that time didn't get many opportunities to fly such hazardous experimental programs. Plus, he felt he had a lot to prove as the B-29 lifted off for his 9th powered flight on the morning of October 14th. He'd already flown out to Mach 0.997, just a hair's breadth away from the sonic wall. And yet, what lay ahead was still a mystery. There were still many who thought that what he was attempting was tantamount to suicide. At 20,000 feet, the X-1 was released. Igniting the chambers of his rocket engine, Yeager began to climb. Then at 43,000 feet, the X-1 shot through the sound barrier and remained supersonic for about 20 seconds. The sharp double crack of the sonic boom that morning signaled the dawn of a remarkable era during which a high desert outpost called Muroc would become identified with the most daring concepts of aviation. It had triggered a series of events which would ultimately evolve man beyond the atmosphere and into space. But first, the remarkable potential of the turbojet engine had to be realized, and there were perplexing challenges to be overcome before that could happen. Not only were the early engines underpowered, they also consumed enormous quantities of fuel, which severely limited range capability. Turboprops offered an attractive alternative, but the XP-81's performance simply couldn't match that promised by pure jet configurations. The XF-85 Goblin embodied the so-called parasite concept. Designed to be carried in the bomb bay of a heavy bomber, it would be carried deep into enemy territory, released, chase off enemy interceptors, and then return and hook up with the mothership. On the first hookup attempt, however, the test pilot was nearly decapitated. And though a successful hookup was ultimately accomplished, the idea wasn't really practical. Another solution was to build big fighters which could carry vast quantities of fuel. But this was a self-defeating solution, producing increased weight and drag, which imposed unacceptable performance penalties. Thus, most of the long procession of fighter prototypes that were put through their paces at Muroc during the post-war years represented little more than transitional designs. As engine designers tried to build more powerful and fuel-efficient engines, the aircraft designers struggled to develop airframes that could optimize their potential. Most of the new prototypes were overweight, underpowered, and during a time of dramatic technological breakthroughs, already obsolete compared to new designs then coming off the drawing boards. The North American XF-86 was by far the most successful of these transitional designs. The first American jet to employ swept wings to delay the onset of compressibility and enhance high-speed maneuverability, it was already diving to supersonic speeds just 6 months after it first flew in October of 1947, and it went on to enjoy a better than 10-to-1 kill ratio against enemy fighters in hostile skies over Korea. Post-war bomber development ran into many of the same problems encountered by the fighter programs. Most of the new prototype bombers on the ramp at Muroc represented early attempts to blend the new turbojet technology with conventional aerodynamic designs. In fact, America's first jet bomber, the Douglas XB-43, resulted from a simple, straightforward modification of a piston-engined XB-42. Graceful and streamlined, the XB-46 was already considered obsolete when it arrived at Muroc at the end of its first flight in April of 1947. And the robust B-45, though it went into operational service, was from the very outset never intended to serve as anything more than an interim bomber. As with the fighters, the first true advance came with the introduction of swept wings in Boeing's B-47. Capable of speeds in excess of 600 miles per hour, this airplane was developed into the thoroughbred of the Air Force's post-war bomber fleet. The most radical design by far, however, was Northrop's Mammoth flying wing. Originally designed with a complicated system of pusher props and designated the XB-35, it was ultimately reconfigured with jets, transformed into the majestic YB-49. The culmination of Northrop's attempts to build a pure flying wing represented a bold leap into the future. Those who saw it knifing its way through the skies over Muroc will never forget. One of its test pilots was a young Californian named Captain Glenn Edwards. Along with Major Dan Forbes, he was flying one of the prototypes in June of 1948 when it broke apart in the sky northwest of the base. All 5 crew members were lost. In December of 1949, Muroc Air Force Base was renamed in honor of the young test pilot. As the base entered the 50s, the tempo increased dramatically. A wide variety of new types and models of aircraft appeared on the flight line every year, as Edwards became known as the place where the rubber meets the ramp. It had long since become the de facto center of American flight research, and in June of 1951, that status was finally recognized officially, as the base was designated the U.S. Air Force Flight Test Center. A $120 million master plan was implemented to build an entirely new main base complex north of the existing facility. But the mission went far beyond flight testing. At the north end of the lakebed, tests were being run on a 2,000-foot deceleration track where Colonel John Stapp and his team of aeromedical researchers were studying the human body's tolerance for G-forces and developing safety equipment that would save countless lives. Using himself as a test subject, Stapp ultimately proved that when properly restrained, the human body was amazingly resilient. The world's fastest railroad was in operation at the south end of the lakebed, likened to an outdoor wind tunnel, because everything from airfoils and aerodynamic shapes to ejection systems and other aircraft components could be tested in real-world conditions. A 10,000-foot high-speed sled track permitted speeds of more than 1,500 miles per hour. While the rocket sleds blistered across the flatlands below, another, much different enterprise was getting underway, high on a granite ridge overlooking the lakebed. At the Air Force's captive missile test site, the ground quaked with the massive roar of the rocket engines that would begin to launch America into the space age. Back in the 30s and 40s, men had come to Muroc to train for combat. In the early 50s, they started coming to train as test pilots. By the time the Air Force's Experimental Test Pilot School moved from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to Edwards in 1951, the role of the test pilot had undergone a radical change from the pre-jet era. The job had always required exceptional precision flying skills, keen powers of observation, coolness under pressure, and the ability to fly a mission exactly as planned. But the young pilots of the 50s faced a much more complex situation. The arrival of the jet engine, along with an incredible proliferation of onboard systems, had greatly magnified the difficulties inherent in the job. In addition to new problems of stability and control, the high-speed envelope left a much smaller margin for error. The amount of time in which to make critical decisions was dramatically compressed. The ever-increasing complexity of the aircraft gave test pilots a lot more to think about. Thus, in addition to exceptional flying skills, applicants to the school now had to have solid engineering backgrounds. And once they entered, they were subjected to an increasingly rigorous academic curriculum before they got the opportunity to learn the intricacies of performance testing. For they had to learn to control airspeed to the nearest knot and hold their altitude at extraordinarily precise levels to define how far, how fast, and how efficiently an airplane could fly. They went on to learn how to evaluate the subtle nuances of aircraft stability and control and the often breathtaking intangibles of spin testing. They had to learn the art of dispassionate data collection while gyrating and plummeting toward an onrushing lakebed. There was no dearth of qualified applicants because by the early 50s, a whole mystique had grown up about Edwards. It had become a mecca for the very best. Men like Chuck Yeager, Tony LeVere, Bob Hoover, Bill Bridgman, Scott Crossfield, Pete Everest, and Fitz Fulton. In an age fascinated by higher, faster, farther, these men gained worldwide fame. A great many others were lost, riding on the cutting edge of calamity. But they came nevertheless, because if it was new, if it was fast, if it was unconventional, it was at Edwards, and it was there that they could pit their skills against the very best among their peers. Then, as now, test pilots were intensely competitive, but not always cocky. They were supremely self-confident. They had to be. They were courageous. They were also disciplined and cautious, always methodically calculating the odds. They were not careless. They couldn't afford to be. There wasn't any margin for error in their business. Knowledge and careful preparation were survival tools. The popular image of the devil-may-care test pilot raising hell all night and breaking records the next morning was largely a fiction of tabloid journalism. As Chuck Yeager once so aptly put it, you can't hoot with the owls all night and fly with the eagles all day. It just don't work that way. But competitive, yes. By late 1953, the NACA's Scott Crossfield had already taken the Navy's D-558-2 Douglas skyrocket out to Mach 1.96. Pretty good for an airplane which hadn't been designed to fly that fast. But he wanted that next magic number, Mach 2, and he knew that just down the flight line, Yeager was preparing to fly the X1A, which had been designed to easily exceed that speed. On November 20th, he went up knowing it would be his last chance, and flying an extraordinarily precise profile, he was able to hit Mach 2.005 in a shallow dive. 3 weeks later, Yeager went up intending to obliterate his rival's new record. And indeed he did. But shortly after hitting Mach 2.44, 1,650 miles per hour, he encountered something terrifyingly new as the X1A tumbled violently out of control. It was called inertial coupling. The X1A was literally spinning about all three of its axes. Somehow, after tumbling downward wildly for more than 40,000 feet, he recovered to level flight and with superb flying skill brought the airplane back to fly another day. Just 8 months later, Major Kit Murray flew it up above 90,000 feet. Their record stood for less than 3 years. By July of 1956, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Pete Everest had flown the Bell X2 all the way out to Mach 2.87, where he began to encounter the effects of aerodynamic heating. But he warned of serious stability problems at that speed. Then, in early September, Captain Ivan C. Kincheloe Jr. claimed a new altitude mark as he climbed above 126,000 feet. 3 weeks later, on his first flight in a rocket airplane, Captain Milburn Mel Apt took it up for an assault on Mach 3. He sped to Mach 3.2 that day, more than 2,000 miles per hour. He became the fastest man alive, but only for brief moments. Shortly after hitting top speed, the X2 spun violently out of control. Bitten like Yeager by inertial coupling, Apt struggled gallantly to recover the craft. His efforts were in vain. Mach 3 had been conquered, but at a terrible price. Not all of the research involved rocket planes. The Air Force, along with the NACA, conducted a whole series of programs with exotic research vehicles. The XF-92A demonstrated the feasibility of the Delta Wing. It introduced pilots to the touchiness of hydraulically boosted, irreversible flight controls. The needle-nosed X3 Stiletto was ultimately used to explore the problem of high-speed instability. The X4 Bantam studied the transonic flying qualities of a swept-wing, semi-tailless design. The X5 demonstrated the performance advantages to be gained by sweeping the wings forward and aft in flight, a concept that would later bear fruit in the design of several frontline combat aircraft. And the unmanned Mach 2 X10 laid the foundation for remote control of a variety of high-performance drone vehicles. Runway vulnerability had long been a major concern. Project Zelmo, with zero-length launch and matte landing, was one of the solutions posed to deal with it. The Zel part proved feasible. Strap a rocket booster on the belly of an F-84, ignite it, and 2.5 seconds later, you're safely airborne. But the Mal part proved just a little more difficult. Zelmo was not the answer. What was needed were true VTOL, or vertical takeoff and landing airplanes. Powered by counter-rotating props, the XF-V1 was supposed to take off and land vertically and transition to conventional flight. Though capable of in-flight transitions, it never achieved either a vertical takeoff or landing. But the jet-powered X-13 Vertijet successfully demonstrated both. And by proving that VTOL flight was possible on jet thrust alone, it opened up a whole new arena of flight. All of the esoteric data from the research programs was applied to the development of new operational designs, and the 50s finally saw the culmination of the turbojet revolution, with the development of aircraft which embodied a mature blending of efficient turbojet propulsion and streamlined aerodynamic design. This was nowhere more evident than with the arrival of the famous Century series of truly supersonic fighters. The F-100 Super Sabre, the F-101 Voodoo, the F-102 Delta Dagger, the Mach 2 F-104 Starfighter, the F-105 Thunder Chief, later known more simply as the Thud, the F-106 Delta Dart, hailed as the ultimate interceptor, and the F-107 Ultra Sabre, the only Century Series fighter not to go into operational service. These truly spectacular airplanes defined the basic speed and altitude envelopes for fighters for the rest of the century. And yet each of them also arrived at Edwards with critical flaws which required years of patient effort to eliminate. But of course, that's always been the purpose of flight testing. High-performance fighters were only part of the story. Test pilots and engineers refined the capabilities of everything from a new turboprop heavy freighter, the C-133 Cargo Master, to the extremely agile and versatile C-130 Hercules, a classic design which would become the model for tactical transports, and the first jet-powered tanker, the KC-135 Stratotanker, which would remain in service until well into the next century, as well as a new, truly intercontinental strategic bomber, the YB-52 Stratofortress, which would provide the safety net of nuclear deterrence for more than a generation. And by the end of the 50s, the sleek B-58 Hustler, the delta-winged bomber which would establish some speed and time-to-climb records, would still have yet to be broken. As the 60s opened, a group of pilots were undergoing zero-G and other types of training at Edwards. They'd go on to win celebrity status as the Mercury astronauts. They were the first of 3 groups of astronauts whose exploits remained front-page news as they were catapulted into space in cone-shaped capsules. But there was another group of pilots at Edwards who'd make the journey by a much different means. A rocket-powered airplane, the North American X-15. As the decade opened, Scott Crossfield, who'd helped design the airplane, was completing its flight worthiness demonstration in preparation for the combined Air Force, NASA, and Navy program to probe the unknowns of hypersonic and near-space flight. Then, within the brief span of 8 months in 1961, the X-15's awesome potential was finally unleashed as it became the first aircraft to exceed Mach 4, 5, and 6. The pilot who made each of those flights, Major Robert M. White, was also the first to fly it in space, as he climbed above 300,000 feet the following year. And in August of 1963, NASA's Joe Walker took it all the way up to 354,000 feet, or 67 miles above the Earth's surface, a record which still stands. 12 men flew the X-15. 8 of them became astronauts by flying an airplane through space. And one of them would go on to become the first man to set foot on the moon. But the program wasn't free of incidents. In November of 1962, for example, NASA's Jack McKay lost power shortly after launch and was forced to attempt an emergency landing on Cutterback Lake in Nevada, with nearly full fuel tanks and without landing flaps. At touchdown, the left gear failed. McKay survived the incident, but the airplane looked like a total loss. It was resurrected, however, as the X-15A2, with a pair of jettisonable external fuel tanks to enable it to reach for higher speeds, and covered with a thermal protection coating to protect it from the 2,000-degree heat expected at those speeds. Major Pete Knight took it all the way out to Mach 6.7, 4,520 miles per hour, one day in October 1967. But at a speed more than twice that of a .50 caliber bullet, the thermal protection failed, permitting torch-like hypersonic air to incinerate parts of the ventral tail, and only by dint of his exceptional piloting skills was he able to bring it safely back. Charred by its wild ride through the inferno of re-entry, it would never fly again. Pete Knight's record still remains the highest speed at which any man has ever flown in an airplane. As the pace of the space program gained momentum, there were all kinds of related activities at Edwards. At the NASA facility, for instance, they were testing an ungainly-looking machine which symbolized one of man's greatest aspirations, the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle. And at the test pilot school, renamed the Aerospace Research Pilot School, students were now introduced to such arcane subjects as thermodynamics, orbital mechanics, and bioastronautics, and given training in a wide variety of machines designed to simulate various space flight conditions. The training they received served them well, and a great many of them, like Jim McDivitt, Frank Borman, and Michael Collins, would go on to make their marks in space. While spaceflight captured the nation's imagination, the Flight Test Center was still in business to evaluate airplanes. A new supersonic trainer, the T-38 Talon. A rugged new fighter, the F-4 Phantom II, which went on to become a mainstay of the Tactical Air Command. A pair of new transports, the C-141 Starlifter and its big brother, the gargantuan C-5A Galaxy. And a new Mach 2 fighter bomber, the swing-wing F-111. While those who tested these airplanes didn't get much publicity, their work could be every bit as thrilling as a Mach 5 re-entry in the X-15.
Okay, it's spinning. That's a spin. Okay, it's a spin. Yeah. Okay, now go ahead. Okay. It looks like a filter, right? Yeah, yeah. Opposite. Pull right. Recording some of the flow. Okay. Wait a minute. Keep this stick forward. Come forward. Girl. Going back into the spin, I think. Yeah, I think it is. All right. There you go. Now it's covered. You got it. You got it. I just like the story. With this game off. Just so you got it. Good trail. You got it. You got it. Get out, mate. 14. Eject.
They were a pair of aircraft whose incredibly advanced capabilities still dazzled the imagination. The mammoth 500,000-pound XB-70 Valkyrie was almost routinely flown at Mach 3 speeds and altitudes of 70,000 feet. More impressive still was the mysterious YF-12 Blackbird. Predecessor of the legendary SR-71, this remarkable airplane was able to cruise for extended periods at speeds in excess of Mach 3 and at altitudes somewhere above 80,000 feet. On a single day at Edwards in May of 1965, it set no less than 9 world speed and altitude records without in any way taxing its full potential. While some pilots cruised along at better than 2,000 miles per hour, others explored the concept of laminar flow control, the elimination of drag-inducing boundary layer turbulence over the wings of the X-21A. And still others continued the study of VTOL flight. The experimental X-18 tilt-wing aircraft spawned the much more ambitious XC-142. Pilots could transition its entire wing and engine assembly to the vertical for takeoff and then to the horizontal for conventional flight. Though a feasible concept, the future still seemed to lie with jet thrust. The XV-5 Vertifan employed that thrust to drive counter-rotating fans within its wings to create vertical lift. More radical still, the XV-6A Kestrel relied upon vectored thrust, provided by its powerful turbofan engine and channeled through rotating nozzles. The technology so ably demonstrated by this experimental airplane would be applied directly to the design of the successful Harrier and AV-8 combat aircraft of today. It was called the Flying Bathtub. Fabricated from steel tubing and plywood, the M2F1 was the first in a series of curious-looking wingless craft that descended to landings on Rogers Dry Lake from the mid-60s through the early 70s. They were called lifting bodies, and subsequent designs such as the M2F2, HL-10, X-24A, and X-24B were all metal and rocket-powered. They were used to determine whether or not, through the use of energy management techniques, these low lift-to-drag shapes could make precision landings after high-speed, unpowered gliding descents from high altitudes. The descents in these craft, NASA's Milt Thompson noted, were so rapid that the lakebed rushes up towards you like a straight arm from a fullback. Nevertheless, they demonstrated that they could indeed make precision landings, even on concrete runways, with remarkable touchdown accuracies. And in doing so, they made a signal contribution to the American space effort because they validated the approach and landing techniques that would later be employed by the first true spaceships, the Space Shuttle. Edwards witnessed the beginning of a new revolution during the 70s. Whereas in the past, the emphasis had been on making airplanes fly faster and higher, now it was on making them fly more efficiently. A wide array of new aerodynamic concepts and sophisticated systems based on high-speed computers made this possible. In the early 70s, NASA modified an F-8 Crusader to explore a new aerodynamic concept, the supercritical wing. Flattened on top, tapering downward at the trailing edge, the thin wing promised enormous performance advantages, permitting jetliners to increase their speeds while burning less fuel. The success of this program gave rise to the NASA Air Force F-111 TACT, Transonic Aircraft Technology program, in which the concept was explored for possible military applications. The advent of compact, high-speed digital computers enabled NASA to explore the potential of fly-by-wire flight controls on another modified F-8. In addition to their speed and light weight, constantly active controls combined with electronic sensors could provide artificial stability and thus relieve designers of the burden of having to build inherently stable aircraft and focus instead on peak performance and agility. The Air Force went on to pursue the logic of the electronics revolution with the Digitac A-7 aircraft, which provided the pilot with selectable control modes, each of them tailored to optimize the craft's tracking and handling qualities for a specific weapons delivery task, such as bombing or air-to-air or air-to-ground gunnery. The advantages conferred by these and other new technologies were quickly applied to new operational designs. The YF-16 Fighting Falcon, for example, was the first to employ digital fly-by-wire, which permitted it to be inherently unstable. It also permitted the F-16 to be used as a test bed to investigate newer control-configured concepts, which could be applied to future generation fighter designs. While the YF-16 had bested the twin-engine YF-17 in the Air Force's competition for a lightweight fighter, the YF-17, impressive in its own right, would ultimately be developed into the Navy's very successful FA-18 Hornet. Dramatic breakthroughs in metallurgy and propulsion technology permitted the new F-15 Eagle to be configured with engines whose thrust, for the first time, exceeded the aircraft's weight. The first Air Force fighter designed specifically for the air superiority role since the legendary F-86, its unparalleled performance, combined with its vast array of sophisticated radar and fire control systems, provided it with an unparalleled combat capability. It had also been years since the Air Force had dedicated an aircraft solely to close air support. That gap was filled in the early 70s when the YA-9 flew head-to-head against the YA-10 in a competition ultimately won by the A-10. Literally built around a 30mm cannon, the Thunderbolt II developed into a combat system capable of delivering awesome destructive firepower. While test pilots at Edwards evaluated the capabilities of a new advanced tanker cargo aircraft, the wide-body KC-10 extender, flight researchers were also investigating the future of air transport with the YC-14 and YC-15, a pair of short takeoff and landing technology demonstrators embodying the latest concepts in aerodynamics, propulsion, and flight controls, which would be applied directly to the next generation of cargo aircraft. For the first time in more than 2 decades, the combat potential of a new intercontinental strategic bomber was also evaluated. The B-1 was designed to contend with the revolution in air defense technologies which had taken place since the late 50s. Instead of speed and altitude, elusiveness was now the key to the penetration of enemy airspace. And the terrain-hugging B-1 was designed to evade enemy radar by flying fast and low. Many said, however, that the day of the manned bomber was past, and in the late 70s it was canceled. But to paraphrase Mark Twain, reports of the demise of the manned bomber and the B-1 were quite premature. For the interim, an old war horse, the venerable B-52, was updated with new avionics and tested as a standoff launch platform for sophisticated air-launched cruise missiles capable of navigating on their own over hundreds of miles of terrain, hitting a target on the center's Utah Test and Training Range with pinpoint accuracy. It would never fly in space or even exceed the speed of sound, but the Shuttle Enterprise set the stage for sister ships that would. Launched from the top of a 747 jumbo jet, it would make a critical series of unpowered approach and landing tests at Edwards during 1977 that paved the way for man's first gliding descents from outer space. And indeed, just 4 years later, in April of 1981, Edwards once again became the scene of high drama as the Space Shuttle Columbia's wheels touched down on Rogers Dry Lake after it had passed through a fiery re-entry at more than 17,000 miles per hour halfway around the globe. The shuttles marked the dawn of a new era of space exploration, the era of reusable space vehicles, true space ships. It had seemed only fitting that Edwards, where so much aerospace history had been made, where so much of the work that had made the shuttle possible had been accomplished, that Edwards should be the site of its milestone flights. While shuttle operations proceeded, flight researchers at Edwards continued to advance knowledge in the aeronautical realm throughout the 1980s as they studied the characteristics of unique aircraft, such as NASA's scissor-winged AD-1, which was tested to explore the possible performance advantages to be gained by pivoting an airplane's entire wing while in flight. Benefiting from remarkable advances in composite materials, the X-29 soared on blade-thin wings that actually swept forward so that Air Force and NASA researchers could explore the configuration's potential for enhanced agility, better low-speed handling qualities, and lower stall speeds. The Advanced Fighter Technology Integration, or AFTI F-111, explored the performance advantages promised by a mission-adaptive wing, a flexible, absolutely smooth surface variable cambered wing, which could be configured to optimize maneuverability, performance, and fuel efficiency for each phase of the airplane's envelope. And the AFTI F-16, which incorporated features permitting it to fly as no other aircraft had ever flown. A triplex digital flight control system, and forward-mounted canards, for example, permitted it to turn without banking. A voice-actuated command system, an automated maneuvering attack system, and a host of other new technologies were applicable to the whole spectrum of tactical combat operations. The Air Force's SMTD, Short Takeoff and Landing Maneuver Technology Demonstrator F-15, was yet another one-of-a-kind testbed. Configured with two-dimensional thrust vectoring and reversing engine nozzles, it demonstrated much enhanced agility and dramatically improved STOL capabilities. Over the years, veteran test pilot Fitz Fulton had skillfully guided many a stricken ship to safe landings at Edwards. But in December of 1984, he was sitting in a cockpit on the ground as he intentionally guided a perfectly healthy 720 jetliner to a crash landing. The test was conducted to evaluate a fuel additive which promised to prevent the ignition of massive fireballs. It obviously didn't work, and predictably reporters called the test a failure. They were wrong. Not only did it demonstrate the ineffectiveness of the additive, it also provided a wealth of information that would enhance flight safety in the future. One of the most spectacular events of the 80s, however, occurred not on the lakebed, but high over the Pacific, where Major Doug Pearson prepared to find the proverbial needle in a haystack as he launched a missile toward a satellite orbiting high overhead.
Eagle 06 is in the recovery. Hey, you beautiful son of a bitch! God, is that beautiful? F-15 all over the sky and missiles going up. Look at that Hummer. I had to do one little roll anyway.
The anti-satellite missile scored a direct hit in a technological feat which might never again be duplicated. One-of-a-kind aircraft and events have become almost commonplace at Edwards over the years, but they represent only a small part of the center's workload. The primary job has always been to ensure that if the need arises, American air crews will go into combat with the most effective and reliable operational aircraft in the world. And it continued to meet this challenge as the capabilities of existing systems were refined and expanded, and as dynamic new capabilities, such as the Lantern system, were added. The painstaking development of this system at Edwards paid off dramatically, as Lantern proved it could deny adversaries the once comforting sanctuary of night. Because they're expected to have extended service lives, modern combat planes are designed with an enormous amount of growth potential, which will enable them to meet new requirements and keep up with the rapid pace of technological change. The modified F-16XL, for example, was proposed to meet a new requirement for a fighter combining air-to-air and interdiction capabilities. Its potential was compared with that of the twin-engine F-15 in an evaluation which ultimately resulted in the development of a new F-15E dual-role fighter, a craft which would go on to prove its remarkable combat effectiveness in the Persian Gulf. All airplanes, and especially highly sophisticated combat airplanes, suffer growing pains as they pass through the lengthy ordeal of development. The B-1B, revived in the early 80s, certainly had more than its share of critics throughout the decade, but it truly represented an amalgam of incredibly complex, state-of-the-art systems. And despite its critics, it was developed into the most potent penetrating bomber in the world. More impressive still, promising the ability to penetrate any airspace without the need for complex defensive avionics, the B-2 Advanced Technology Bomber was the first giant flying wing to soar over the base in 4 decades. Its thin silhouette, compound curves, and its stealth technology promised the ultimate cloak of invisibility, even against the most sophisticated air defense radar systems. Like the turbojet engine 4 decades earlier, stealth technology promised to revolutionize the design and capabilities of combat aircraft. And as the Flight Test Center entered the 90s and began to face the tremendous technological challenges of the 21st century, it was engaged in the evaluation of a pair of competing designs which embodied the latest in that technology. The radically different appearance of the YF-22 and the YF-23 was really but a pale reflection of the quantum leap in capabilities which each represented. Built for stealth, they were also beneficiaries of the many technologies and innovative concepts which had recently proven their worth in tests at Edwards. Indeed, they took them a step or more further and blended them into fighter prototypes whose capabilities could stretch the imagination. To fighter pilots from any previous era, for example, the possibility that they could cruise at supersonic speeds without use of an afterburner was little more than a fantasy. In these aircraft, the dream became reality. Incredibly worthy opponents, only one could win. And in April 1991, the YF-22 was selected to project American airpower into the 21st century as the advanced tactical fighter. Flight testing such craft has become a remarkably complex operation. Where once, not so long ago, knee pads and pilot recall provided practically the only instrumentation, systems-intensive fighters are now instrumented for as many as 4,000 different parameters, and the data is telemetered constantly to the ground for analysis, even before the pilot touches down. We're in an age of spiraling technology, especially in the burgeoning field of electronic systems, and this has created an information explosion which makes each flight test hour incredibly valuable and costly. To reduce those costs, the Flight Test Center has built up an impressive ground test capability in recent years. The largest anechoic chamber in the nation, a neighboring facility for integrated avionics testing, and a test and evaluation missions simulator. They comprise the core of the capability to thoroughly test a full range of onboard electronic systems on the ground before they're subjected to the real world of flight test, where indeed they'll always still have to ultimately prove their worth. Edwards has been called the place dreams take flight. And truly, for more than 40 years, the Air Force and the whole world of aerospace have continued to meet its future in the skies above its sprawling expanse. The history of the base is a kaleidoscope of images representing man's greatest achievements in flight. There's a special feeling one gets there, an awareness of continuity. The lakebed remains a welcome haven for pilots in distress, an uncommon sense of achievement and tradition, unforgettable links to a legendary past, and an overpowering feeling of expectation of a limitless future. And almost an article of faith, the belief that if it can happen, it will probably happen here. The story of Edwards, then, is a fabric woven of change and continuity, so well symbolized by the Test Center's logo, for the legend at its base Ad inexplorata, Latin for toward the unexplored, is really more than just a motto. It represents a bridge between its past, its present, and its future.
Near the center of the Mojave Desert, less than 100 miles northeast of Los Angeles, lies a huge level expanse of hard-baked clay and silt known as Rogers Dry Lake. Its glistening surface, 5 miles wide, extends for a length of 13 miles. This lakebed was made to order for aircraft like the X3, which requires a 3-mile takeoff run, or the X-10 research missile, which once used up 7 miles of lakebed runway on a landing in which the parabrake failed to deploy. Over $330 million worth of aeronautical equipment has been successfully recovered under emergency conditions on the lakebed. On the western shore of this hard-packed dry lake, the Air Research and Development Command established the Air Force Flight Test Center to test the aircraft and weapon systems of the future. Edwards Air Force Base is undergoing extensive rebuilding and modernization. Old and antiquated wooden buildings are rapidly being replaced with permanent structures. A new 15,000-foot concrete runway was officially dedicated on October 12, 1954, by Lieutenant General Thomas S. Power and Brigadier General J.S. Holtener, who cut the ribbon, clearing the way for the first takeoff on the new runway. An F-100 flown by Lieutenant Colonel Pete Everest. The new runway is connected to the lakebed by an 1,800-foot overrun at the east end. The new 142-foot control tower provides excellent visibility in all directions. Just west of the control tower is the new hangar and maintenance shop, which together cover over 9 acres. The hangar has a clear floor area of 4 1/2 acres. It is 605 feet long, 300 feet wide, and has a ceiling clearance of 75 feet. Flight testing of research aircraft is an important medium for obtaining data on advanced airfoils and new propulsion systems for application in the design of future tactical aircraft. The X1E rocket-powered research aircraft, a new version of the X1, was designed by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. A B-29 mother airplane is employed to carry the X1E to release altitude. New design features will enable the X1E to attain a speed of Mach 2.8, over 2,000 miles per hour. The first powered flight was scheduled for December 15, 1955. Prior to this flight, a successful captive and glide flight had been conducted. On this flight, release and breakaway were normal. However, due to excessive fuel pressures, the engine failed to ignite. Rocket fuel was jettisoned, and the flight was utilized to further verify glide flight test objectives. External design features of the X1E include a built-up windshield for improved visibility and a new 4% wing. The flight terminated in a successful dead-stick landing on the dry lakebed. Another rocket-propelled research airplane, the Bell X2, was designed to obtain comprehensive aerodynamic and temperature data at supersonic speeds. It is capable of speeds up to 2,250 miles per hour and altitudes up to 100,000 feet. The X2 is carried to release altitude in the bomb bay of a B-50 mother airplane. Following captive and non-powered glide flights, the first powered flight was conducted December 18, 1955. To delay structural problems resulting from aerodynamic heating, the fuselage and tail surfaces of the X2 are constructed of K-Monel. The 40-degree swept-back wings are fabricated of stainless steel. At an altitude of 33,000 feet, turbine spin checks and starts were conducted. The X2 was launched at an altitude of 29,400 feet and an airspeed of 255 miles per hour. Breakaway was normal, and approximately 4 seconds later, the rocket engine was started. Power is supplied by a Curtiss-Wright rocket engine capable of delivering a controlled range of thrust from 2,500 to 15,000 pounds. Dry weight of the X2 is approximately 10,500 pounds. It carries nearly 14,000 pounds of fuel. The nose section of this 37-foot aircraft is a pressurized cabin, which may be jettisoned in an emergency. In this event, a ribbon-type parachute deploys to decelerate and stabilize the nose section until a safe bailout altitude is reached. The landing gear consists of one main skid under the fuselage, a nose wheel, and secondary skids under each wing for lateral support. On this flight, the right wing skid failed to extend, and the nose wheel, though fully extended, was cocked at a 45-degree angle. However, as the X2 touched down on the lakebed, the nose wheel castered properly. Touchdown speed was 200 miles per hour. The X2 came to rest in a wing-level attitude after a ground run of 4,000 feet. The Rascal missile, developed by Bell Aircraft Company for use with the B-47 bomber, began performance testing in October 1954. This supersonic, rocket-powered guided missile was developed for deployment against targets difficult to approach. The Rascal missile was first tested with B-36 and B-50 aircraft, and in both cases the missile was carried in the bomb bay. For use with the B-47, modifications were necessary to permit mounting under the right wing. The missile is 5 feet in diameter, 30 feet in length, and weighs 19,000 pounds. It was designed for a speed of Mach 2.5 and a range of 100 miles. The lower fin of the missile folds upward to allow clearance for takeoff and landing when attached to the B-47 bomber. On a test conducted November 23, 1954, the folding tail fin was lowered while in flight and could not be retracted, making it necessary to jettison the missile before landing. Guidance and control tests are now being conducted at Holloman Air Development Center, New Mexico. Project Zelmo is the code name applied to the Glenn L. Martin development of a new system for taking off and landing fighter-type aircraft. The basic elements of Zelmo are zero-length launchings and arrested landings on inflated rubber mats. An X-224 rocket booster producing 70,000 pounds thrust permits launching of the F-84G at operational weights above 20,000 pounds. Following a series of successful piloted launchings consummating in runway landings, the arrested landing phase was begun. The landing mat, composed of 27 air-inflated rubber mattresses, provides a landing area 80 feet wide by 400 feet long. An arresting cable is installed at the approach end of the mat. The pilot approaches the mat with flaps extended. When the landing hook comes in contact with the arresting cable, the flaps are automatically retracted. The first mat landing was attempted June 2, 1954. On this attempt, the landing hook contacted the approach ramp and skipped over the arresting cable. The aircraft sank into the mat and bounced off the far end. The aircraft was damaged beyond economical repair, and the pilot sustained minor injuries. After mat repairs and modifications to the arresting gear, trial landings were begun. Following several flybys with a light rope substituted for the arresting cable, the first of 2 successful mat landings was made. Inspection of the aircraft following landings have revealed no evidence of structural failure. Flight testing of the Ryan X-13 vertical takeoff research airplane began in August 1955. The X-13 was designed to investigate vertical takeoff and landings. Jet thrust will be the only means of sustention, and required control forces will be obtained by utilizing jet stream diversion at the tailpipe. For pilot visibility and comfort when flying in the vertical attitude, the seat will rotate forward approximately 45 degrees. Considerable instability was encountered on the first flights. Yaw and roll dampers were installed, and the stability characteristics were greatly improved. A non-retractable tricycle landing gear will be eliminated for the vertical flight phase. The X-13 has a gross weight of 7,500 pounds. Its 60-degree delta wing, mounted high on the fuselage, has a span of 21 feet. Jet thrust is provided by a Rolls-Royce engine rated at 9,500 pounds thrust. Preparations are currently underway for the vertical flight and hovering phase of testing. All of the Air Force and most of the Navy advanced fighter and interceptor aircraft undergo comprehensive flight testing at the Flight Test Center. The McDonnell F101A Voodoo long-range strategic fighter is currently undergoing Phase 4 and 6 testing. In addition to its role as a strategic fighter, it will be required to deliver special stores. It is capable of gross weights up to 50,000 pounds. The F-101 is 67 feet long and has a wingspan of 39 feet. Wings and stabilizer are swept back 35 degrees. Power is supplied by two Pratt & Whitney J57 turbojet engines with short afterburners. Each engine is rated at 10,200 pounds sea-level static thrust at military power and at 15,000 pounds with afterburners at maximum power. Armament will consist of four 20mm automatic guns controlled by an MA-7 fire control system. Test performance data includes a maximum speed of Mach 1.44 or 830 knots true airspeed, a combat ceiling of 49,500 feet, service ceiling of 50,200 feet, and a maximum operational radius of action of 500 nautical miles without in-flight refueling. The Convair YF-102A is a supersonic delta-wing all-weather interceptor and is an advanced version of the original F-102. It is designed for 5,000-foot full-load takeoffs, an operational ceiling of 53,000 feet, and the capability of intercepting enemy bombers at speeds up to Mach 1.3. The first flight of the YF-102A was made on December 20th, 1954, and on the second day of testing, it demonstrated supersonic speed in level flight. Modifications differentiating this aircraft from the F-102 include an increase in nose section taper and length and extension of the aft section by 6 feet for an overall length of 68 feet to follow the NACA area progression rule, an improved J57 turbojet engine, increasing thrust to a maximum of 16,000 pounds, and a wing with a cambered leading edge and reflex tips to decrease drag at cruising speeds. The TF-102A, a jet trainer version of the F-102A, is in current engineering flight test. This is the first two-place trainer developed specifically for any of the Century Series aircraft and the only side-by-side version planned. The contour of the F-102A was changed drastically to permit side-by-side seating. Aft of the cockpit, the trainer and fighter are identical. A new Air Force fighter now in production is the Lockheed F104A. Its military applications include escort, intercept, and air superiority missions. The F104A has a predicted maximum speed and altitude of Mach 2 and 60,000 feet, and a maximum rate of climb of 52,700 feet per minute. Its estimated climb from brake release to 35,000 feet is 1.1 minutes. The F-104A is the production version of the XF-104, which was intensively flight tested for approximately 2 years at the Air Force Flight Test Center. The production model differs little in appearance from its prototype. The primary modification is an increase in length to 55 feet, necessary to accommodate the General Electric J-79 turbojet engine with afterburner producing 14,500 pounds thrust, and which will replace the J-65 turbojet used in the XF-104. Height is 13.5 feet. The span of the low aspect ratio straight wing is 22 feet. A downward seat ejection system is provided in the event of an emergency bailout. Outstanding features of the F-104A include leading edge flaps, a boundary layer blower system providing better low-speed control, and stability augmentation in all axes. Armament consists of a T-171 Gatling gun controlled by an MA-10 fire control system with infrared and optical sighting capabilities. A new swept-wing fighter-bomber, the Republic F-105A, is in current flight test. Wingspan is 35 feet, length 61 feet, and the design gross weight is 40,500 pounds. An unusual feature is an internal bomb bay which is specifically designed for the Mk-7 special store. Power is supplied by a Pratt & Whitney J57 turbojet with afterburner. Maximum design speed is Mach 1.29 at 35,000 feet. The F-105B will have a Pratt & Whitney J75 engine capable of delivering 23,500 pounds thrust. This will increase the maximum speed to near Mach 2 at altitudes up to 48,000 feet. In addition to internal bomb storage, various combinations of bombs and rocket pods can be carried externally. The airplane is also equipped with a T-171 20mm Gatling gun. On a typical fighter-bomber mission, the F-105A at 40,561 pounds gross weight can carry 1,700 pounds of stores for a radius of 967 nautical miles. The first flight, 45 minutes in duration, was made October 22, 1955. At El Centro, California, the Air Force component of the Defense Department's Joint Parachute Test Facility is directed by the Air Force Flight Test Center. A parachute whirl tower, a unique installation of this facility, provides an inexpensive means of testing parachutes for opening characteristics and reliability under various loading and speed conditions. A gondola, which carries the test parachute and load, is suspended from a 56-foot boom, which is 120 feet above ground level. The tower is capable of whirling the gondola at speeds up to 500 miles per hour. When rigged parachute and dummy have been installed in the gondola, the drive motors are engaged. The gondola is manually guided in the first 1 or 2 revolutions around the tower. As momentum is gained, centrifugal force and the aerodynamic configuration of the gondola enables it to fly a steady path. When the gondola has been stabilized at a predetermined speed, the operator at the control console releases the parachute. Since the release point is always oriented in the same direction, precise photographic studies can be made. A tensiometer installed in the test dummy provides immediate force data, and additional data is gathered when critical portions of the recovered parachute undergo porosity tests. On this reliability test, high-speed photography is employed to record parachute opening characteristics. All of the testing conducted at this center does not involve the use of aircraft. An experimental rocket engine test station was constructed to conduct development testing of high-thrust engines for missile application. The rocket test site is located on a steep ridge approximately 12 miles from the main base. 3 of the 4 test stands are of cantilever-type construction and can accommodate rocket engine systems up to 400,000 pounds thrust. In an isolated area, directly in back of the test stands, propellants and oxidizers are stored. Huge quantities of propellants are required, for a single large engine firing of 60 seconds duration can consume 10,000 gallons of propellants. In the control center, operators stationed at recorders and electrical sequencing panels prepare for a firing of the North American Integrated Dual Rocket Engine. A periscope is used for observation and study of the flame pattern. In this run, the longest duration and highest thrust level to be recorded was obtained. Total duration was 44 seconds and a thrust of 254,000 pounds. 5,000 gallons of liquid oxygen and 5,000 gallons of water alcohol were consumed in this run. Another rocket engine manufactured by North American Aviation in current test is being developed for the Atlas missile, Weapon System 107A. Additional test stands and support facilities are under construction. When these are complete, the rocket engine test program will be highly accelerated. The new stands will accommodate engines up to 1 million pounds thrust. At the high-speed experimental track facility, rocket-propelled sleds running on a 10,000-foot standard gauge railroad track provide an increasingly important means of testing missile and aircraft components or assemblies under conditions of high speed and acceleration. Many varied tests are conducted without the risk or expense of operating test aircraft. The track is fully instrumented for high-speed motion picture study of each test run. Recent tests were conducted to study the seat ejection escape system for the B-66 airplane. Instrumentation installed on the test dummies records accelerations encountered during the ejection sequence. Initial propulsion force is provided by a solid propellant pusher sled. When these rockets burn out, the two sleds separate and the rockets on the test sled are remotely fired to accelerate it to the desired test velocity. 3 test seats equipped with dummies are ejected from the forward fuselage of the B-66, which is mounted to the test sled. In this run, high-speed cameras record seat trajectory, rotation, and the relationship between the seat trajectory and the fuselage of the B-66. Sled testing is also ideally suited for testing cargo, recovery, or personnel parachutes at transonic and supersonic speeds. In this instance, the Cook supersonic sled is utilized as the test vehicle to test the recovery parachute for the X2 escape capsule. The sled is powered by a 50,000-pound variable thrust liquid rocket engine manufactured by North American Aviation. In this run, parachute opening characteristics are viewed from a high-speed camera mounted adjacent to the parachute compartment. High-speed track tests have also been conducted to obtain data on the ability of various plastic radome materials to resist erosion when exposed to rainfall at supersonic speeds. Test results will be used to develop new radome materials for supersonic aircraft. The present rainfall curtain is 1,200 feet long. Spray nozzles located on each side of the track are adjustable for rain pattern, water content, and droplet size. On an earlier test, the test item became airborne due to aerodynamic loading at supersonic speeds. Testing can be conducted at speeds up to Mach 2. Many other sleds have made important contributions to the accumulation of test data since the high-speed track was put into operation in 1951. These include a sled for water break evaluation studies, a vehicle designed for full-scale testing of the F104 airplane tail unit, the Century pusher sled, which provides auxiliary power for other test sleds, and the RB-66 sled project to determine airflow buffeting and cockpit noise level with the canopy removed. The highlights of the testing activity conducted at the Flight Test Center serves as an index to the status of development progress in the U.S. Air Force. The weapon systems illustrated in this film have resulted from comprehensive research investigations, which are continuing to maintain and ensure technical superiority in the future.
This ancient dry lake in California's Antelope Valley is not where man first experienced the awesome thrill of flight. But it is where he continued to seek the unknown, where he continued to try the untested, where he continued to reach beyond the horizon. It was just a railroad water stop in the early 1900s, known as Muroc, a reversal of the name of the Coram brothers who settled the area next to Rodriguez or Rogers Dry Lake. A small community grew out of the desolation. In 1934, airplanes based at March Field near Riverside, California, commanded by Colonel Hap Arnold, began flying north to the Mojave Desert lakebed for bombing and gunnery practice. As a result, what came to be called Muroc Lake fell under frequent Mach attack. In 1937, virtually the entire Army Air Corps, some 200 aircraft, took part in maneuvers over its 65-square-mile, concrete-hard surface. This preparation was indeed timely, for the winds of war blew strongly in other parts of the world.
Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked.
The United States entry into World War II brought bombardment and reconnaissance units to Muroc. The thousands of men and women who were assigned served with dedication, and as the importance of the base grew, so did the facilities needed to sustain operations. A primary mission was bomber crew and fighter pilot training. The Muroc Maru, often appearing as a mirage on the lakebed, was there to prepare flyers for anti-shipping strikes. Lead crews flying the mighty B-29 Superfortress also called Muroc home for a time during the war. Meanwhile, a new era was dawning at the north end of the lake. This was the United States' first jet aircraft. The Bell XB-59A Aerocomet first flew in October 1942. The project was a well-guarded secret, as were many that followed. Some would remain anonymous, others would become famous. Later they would be joined by a series of flying wing designs that would come to have a special meaning. They were both propeller-driven and jet and rocket powered. One was actually a flying bomb. Other pusher-type aircraft were also being evaluated. Of course, some were not stable, and they met with a fate man had experienced since his first feeble attempts at flight. Post-war testing even included advanced models developed by our former foes, as well as our own designs, many not even imagined a few years earlier. including one that could kneel for Navy carrier operations, and the new rocket plane began ground testing, along with the fighters, bombers, and larger, more complex versions of the flying wing. Other large craft came to the dry lake. The B-45 was assembled in a Muroc hangar. The B-46 and the B-47 Stratojet, sleek by any standard, were especially so in comparison with the stubby XF-85 Parasite fighter, which folded its wings so that it could be launched and recovered by its B-29 mothership. The early F-86 gave little hint of the many variations that would follow. Yet, some aircraft would never number more than one or two. Just 5 years after America's first jet flight, Captain Chuck Yeager climbed into an experimental rocket craft that was to achieve a significant first for man. The plane was the X1. The milestone, supersonic flight. On October 14, 1947, the sound barrier was broken. Man had exceeded Mach 1, though it was just a start. In 6 years, the speed would be doubled. And in 16, a craft would pass 6 times the speed of sound. But these achievements would make the taste of this first triumph no less sweet. As testing continued, the variety of models grew. But the XF-85 remained one of the most unusual. When the little plane was finally tested in the late 1940s, it suffered a major setback. Its canopy was damaged in a contest with the mothership's trapeze apparatus. It would return to fly again, to join craft like the F-92, which would set design standards for later models. The experimental F-88 looked much like its F-101 successor. The D-558-2 Skyrocket was the first craft to fly at twice the speed of sound, while the X-4 provided data on stability and control at speeds under Mach 1. Failure challenged the ingenuity and determination of Muroc engineers and test pilots. Eventually, the Parasite fighter concept was made a success. As were other prototypes. Yet the risk of reaching beyond the horizon was always present. It was never more deeply felt than in June 1948, when a jet version of the flying wing went down with its crew of 5. The pilot was Major Daniel Forbes of Kansas, and the co-pilot, from California, Captain Glenn Edwards, in whose honor the base was renamed in January 1950. A reconnaissance wing was among the new aircraft of the new decade, as was the Regulus, a pilotless vehicle that could be controlled from the ground. Of course, the need for highly skilled pilots was ever present. In early 1951, the test pilot school of the fledgling Air Force was moved from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio, to Edwards. The job of the test pilot was becoming more complex and demanding, even in the Hollywood movies filmed at the base in the 50s. In June 1951, the Air Force Flight Test Center was officially established. The assortment of craft being tested and evaluated had grown tremendously in 9 short years. Small trainer aircraft were being put through their paces, as were the heavy giants of the sky. This XB-51 starred in a movie, Toward the Unknown. Prototypes of the B-52, first flown in 1952, were brought to the center to be wrung out, and so it was with each later modification of the mighty Stratofortress. The B-60 was adapted from the B-36, and the Navajo, whose engines were also developed and tested at Edwards, continued the exploration of pilotless flight. Fighter aircraft development kept pace during the 50s. With the Super Sabre, the numbers had reached 100. The F-100, also demonstrated in zero-length launch, signaled the first of the line known as the Century Series, followed by the F-101 Voodoo, the F-102 Delta Dagger, and the F-104 Starfighter. The F-105 Thunder Chief exceeded Mach 1 on its maiden flight. The F-106 Delta Dart was an extensive modification of the F-102, while the F-107 a radical redesign of the F-100. This jet came complete with a supersonic propeller. The C-123 provider's name described its capabilities. The C-130 was called Hercules, and the C-133 Cargo Master. The KC-135 Stratotanker ushered in a new era for air refueling, as the unusual U-2 did for weather and photo reconnaissance. From the air, the growth of Edwards was becoming more evident as the first housing foundations were cut into the dry earth. The area was made more habitable and the joys of desert living became clearer. In the mid-50s, the base continued to grow in both size and importance. Major facilities were moved from their original site to a new, more northerly location on the lakeshore. Other buildings, including large hangars and support facilities, were added, and the base area was expanded to over 300,000 acres.
Life could be a dream, sweetheart.
While across the way, on craggy Lehman Ridge, the center's rocket branch was conducting very different kinds of tests. Begun, of course, with the traditional countdown. In another part of the base, Joshua trees bloom next to the rocket sled track, where until 1963, aircraft components and ejection systems were tested. Human endurance was also challenged by Colonel John Stapp, who rode test sleds at hundreds of miles per hour and withstood a force over 40 times gravity. He returned to tell about it. However, instrumented dummies like Sierra Sam were used for the more destructive types of testing. Each sled mission was methodically prepared. The rocket bottles were carefully placed, and our friend Sam, all 200 pounds of him, was made comfortable for the ride, which in this case was to test an ejection system. Cameras were ready to record the run at various speeds and from many angles. Although it appears that this mission ended in failure, it was successful in that it led to the development of an improved ejection system. As for Sam, he survived to become an attraction at a 50s Armed Forces Day display on the flight line, along with some of the sleds being used for testing. A working miniature sled track drew the interest of the crowd inside one of the large hangars. Outside, folks had come for many miles to see some of the test aircraft on static display. Especially the research vehicles, which represented man's continuing quest to conquer near space. One such craft was the X2, which, before its untimely end in 1956, made the world's first Mach 3 manned flight. Its test program was the responsibility of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, whose facility was also located on the edge of the lake. Other research craft were being flown and evaluated by the NACA in the 50s. Technology was expanding rapidly. Late 1958 marked the arrival of the X-15. At the time Edwards became its home, the NACA became the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. Meanwhile, Air Force flight tests continue to tax not only the airworthiness of new and experimental craft, but also the courage of those who flew them. This prototype, first flown in 1959, paved the way for both the F-5 Freedom Fighter and this trainer, the T-38 Talon, which was used to set world records at Edwards in 1961. A different record was set when the first class of astronauts graduated from the Test Pilot School's Aerospace Research Pilot course. They and those who followed would go on to realize many of the space travel dreams of the early 60s. Some of the concepts would not endure, but the people these dreams touched would. Like a young NASA test pilot, Neil Armstrong, then working with the X-15, while across the lakebed, the F-1 rocket engine that would start man on his journey to the moon was being fired for the first time. Other Air Force and NASA pilots would earn their astronaut wings in the X-15. The craft was carried aloft by a B-52 mothership. Precision instruments would track its flight. The X-15 was carried well over 200 miles from Edwards and released at 45,000 feet, returning to the lakebed in less than 10 minutes. Its flight data would be analyzed for years afterwards. The three X-15 vehicles flew a total of 199 missions. It was ironic that the 200th and last flight of the rocket ship was canceled due to a rare desert snowfall. In 1963, the X-21 laminar flow aircraft tested concepts which still hold promise. And the F-4C Phantom began a program which included stall tests like this one. Even with the advent of new fighters, planes of the Century series continued to be modified. This rocket-augmented version of the F-104, with reaction jet controls, was used as an aerospace trainer for future astronauts. The Aerospace Research Pilot School, as it was then called, was in full swing in the early 60s, with a highly technical curriculum that included thrilling aircraft maneuvers, moments of weightlessness, and simulated spaceflight and docking. All followed by a well-earned graduation and possible selection for programs such as the Manned Orbiting Laboratory and the chance to view the Earth as few men had. The center also played an important role in space capsule recovery. Its parachute test squadron checked out the Apollo spacecraft Earth landing system. The squadron, which tested a variety of recovery and deceleration devices, also explored this unique approach to picking up downed pilots using a parachute and balloon system. In the early 60s, a contingent of Army aviation was established at Edwards, primarily to test helicopters. Craft with vertical takeoff and landing capabilities were not new to the dry lake. Some of these test aircraft used propellers or rotors for lift. Others did not. The Lunar Landing Research Vehicle was used to prepare astronauts for moon missions. In composite, the flights of the various craft tested over the years recall the lilt of a waltz. In 1964, Edwards was visited by President Johnson. He was greeted by the base's military and civilian leaders and their families. The president reviewed several of the aircraft undergoing testing, including the Air Force's new pure jet cargo carrier, the C-141 Starlifter. A few months later, the first of two XB-70 Valkyrie triple-sonic bombers arrived for testing. On a later flight, the multi-million-dollar craft experienced landing gear trouble and would not have been able to land safely except for the ingenuity of pilot Al White and Colonel Joe Cotton, who crawled to a relay box in the plane's structure and remedied the problem with a carefully placed paper clip. The craft was lost soon afterward, but the remaining XB-70 continued experimental research and later became part of the Air Force Museum. At about the same time the Great White Bird was being tested, the Blackbird SR-71 and its predecessor, the YF-12, also sliced through the deep blue Edwards sky. And rocket testing continued. The activity was designated the first Air Force laboratory. Where by mishap and on purpose, great explosions shook Lehman Ridge. And, just as in the late 50s, when the Minuteman missile silo launch concept was first tested, the laboratory developed new rocket technologies. And refined proven concepts for present and future applications. with large engines for mighty boosters, and minute thrust devices. Across the lakebed, in April 1965, the flight line was poised for a visit by the nation's vice president. Mr. Humphrey toured the Aerospace Research Pilot School and later visited the NASA Flight Research Center, which was involved with such strange-looking vehicles as the Parasev. Towed aloft, this predecessor of the hang glider tested a concept for possible applications in the space program. Another craft that was towed in its early flights was the wingless M2F1, the first in a series of lifting bodies that included the HL-10, which would later be used in filming a television series about a bionic man. During the latter part of the 60s, proven swing-wing technology was incorporated in the F-111. Once known as the TFX, this aircraft also demonstrated its terrain-following capability. Tests of the F-111 included water ingestion and arresting gear runs, important because the planes of the period were landing at speeds faster than the top speeds of World War I aircraft. Usually, the arresting barrier did its job well. Sometimes there were complications. A tangle could have been a real problem during this balloon pickup from a C-130. This retrieval system is one way to get a jump on the morning rush hour. The C-5 Galaxy was first tested during the late 60s. The huge plane demonstrated its capability for operating from unimproved surfaces. During the same period, a new attack aircraft, the A-7D, was being evaluated. And wide-body jetliners used Edwards for certification testing. Once again, the worth of the facility was demonstrated, as was the skill of the commercial test pilots. The NF-104 was placed by the test pilot school as a silent monument to this kind of skill, developed through a rigorous curriculum that required each hand-picked student to learn more about a wider variety of subjects than ever before. The test pilots were being readied for the 1970s crop of new aircraft, like the A-9 close air support prototype, and the A-10, which could carry up to 16,000 pounds of mixed ordnance. It was later fitted with a 30mm GAU-8 gun that could fire thousands of rounds per minute, fast even when filmed in slow motion. New fighter airplanes also came to the lake for testing, including the F-5E Tiger II, and the F-15 Eagle, which was first flown in July 1972. The unknowns of testing were always present. That winter morning in 1974 was no exception. A mishap was averted when the skilled contractor test pilot turned this seemingly ill-fated high-speed taxi test into the YF-16's unofficial first flight. After some adjustments, the plane's official takeoff took place 2 weeks later. The fighter went on to become one of the most successful craft of its type ever. The YF-16 had competed for continued development with the YF-17, which came on the scene later in 1974. Although the twin-tail, twin-engine craft was not chosen for the Air Force, this prototype was to set the basic design for the Navy F-18. This variation of a Boeing 707 with an extensive airborne warning and control capability was one of the several heavy craft tested at Edwards in the first half of the 70s. Another, the B-1 bomber, was flown to Edwards from a nearby Air Force production facility in December 1974. While this YC-15, a wide-bodied cargo aircraft prototype, flew to Edwards from its Long Beach, California plant in August 1975. Its engines and wing flaps were configured to provide lift for short takeoffs and landings. Meanwhile, a variation of the same lift technology was being developed for the YC-14, which was first flown a year later. Modified space engines were tested, and novel approaches to rocketry continued to be explored at the Air Force Rocket Propulsion Laboratory. A reusable solid propellant test motor called Super Hippo was first fired in 1975, and each day brought with it flight test missions like this one. The aircraft stands ready. Center Commander, Astronaut Thomas Stafford, is briefed. Vital instruments are checked out, and the hundreds of people and pieces of equipment needed for the test become involved as the mission gets underway. Aerial refueling, as important to flight testing as it was in the early days, had come a long way since it was pioneered. A special water-carrying tanker was used to test the effects of icing on new aircraft. The base and its services continued to grow, a far cry from the days when it was no more than a tent city. The activities at Edwards attracted many and varied visitors from the local area and from great distances, as these South American chiefs of staff who came to view the latest test craft and to watch them perform, to experience the freedom of flight. In the mid-70s, the YF-12 was flown for research. Concepts such as a fly-by-wire computerized control system were tested, as was a supercritical wing. Remotely piloted vehicles continue to be flown over the dry lake, and a detachment of the center tested air-launched tactical drones. Unpiloted drop models were used to evaluate extreme performance characteristics of the full-size craft. Testing also continued with lifting bodies. The X-24B, in its last flights, demonstrated the ability to land on a conventional runway surface. The Space Shuttle orbiter, rolled out in late 1976, would also land at Edwards following its initial flights. At first, launched from a modified 747 airliner. Later, to return from its early missions in space. The skilled astronauts would seek out the tiny patch of hard, dry Earth, barely more than a dot on the sprawling landscape. Yet, not an unlikely spot for so triumphant a return. For it is there that so much aviation and space history had been written.